Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Library of Congress this afternoon. And our special thanks to Ambassador BATBAYAR and the Embassy of Mongolia and the conference organizers for including us again in this year's conference. I'm Susan Meinheit, Tibetan and Mongolian specialist in the library's Asian division. And just a couple of notes before we begin. This keynote session is also available to our virtual audience and is being recorded for the library's online archive. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the talks, and any comments or questions will be included in the recording as part of the record. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the Chief of Asian Division, Dr. DONGFANG SHAO.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Greetings from Asian Division. Asian Division is delighted to host the keynote talks for the 15th annual Mongolia Study Conference this year. This is the 6th time for Asian Division to host the keynote talks. Our last one was held in February 2020, and just before the pandemic started. So welcome once again in our in-person guests, as well as those attending remotely. We wish to thank His Excellency BATBAYAR ULZIIDELGERIIN, Ambassador of Mongolia to United States, and also Mongolia Cultural Center and its President Suru Erdin Magyamar, and also William Fiskew, Director of Arctic Studies Center, National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian, for bringing the Mongolia Conference participants to the Library Congress again this year. An Asian Division is a custodial division for library's largest Asian language collections. We have over 4 million physical items in almost 200 Asian languages. We provide reference services, public outreach for each of our collections in Asian Reading Room. The Mongolia collection is one of the largest in the United States, and our Mongolia Tibetan specialist, Susan Meinheit, has prepared a small display from our collection in Reading Room for browsing after the talks. So we invite all of you to enjoy today's presentations and also make use of our collections in our future research needs. Unfortunately, Ambassador BATBAYAR is unable to attend, but it's my pleasure to introduce Deputy Chief of Mission, Board Attorney Yadam Soren, to present opening remarks on his behalf.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation for the organizers to successfully hold this 15th annual Mongol Studies Conference. And I would like also to express the deepest appreciation for the Library of Congress for hosting for the 6th time the keynote speech for this conference. So throughout this morning and this afternoon, we're gonna have some talks about the Mongolia-US relationship and history in the back. From the point of the embassy view, I just wanted to share some few mechanisms which we are working on to develop further the bilateral cooperation between Mongolia and the United States. So as you all know, Mongolia considers the United States as one of the most important partners and an important third neighbor. Mongolia pursues to the foreign policy which is open, multi-pillar, independent, and peace-loving. So with that regard, we have established diplomatic relations in 1987, and since then we have been developing few mechanisms to further develop our ties. The first of all is I would like to mention the annual bilateral consultations that's held between the United States Department of State and Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mongolia. And last autumn, we have hosted in Mongolia the 15th annual bilateral consultations. This is an important platform for us to discuss and evaluate the current situation, the stances of both many issues in bilateral relations. And that's also an important platform to discuss further what shall we do in the future and what's our midterm and long-term goals. So during this platform, we discuss not only political issues, but also the economic, education, culture, people to people, and all different types of relations. It involves different stakeholders from cabinet ministries. The second important platform for the bilateral cooperation is in the economic sector. We have actually on economic sector, Economic Development Partnership Dialogue, which we have organized the 4th event here in Washington in early February. Our State Secretary from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. DONGFANG, was here for this talks this year. And this year was the 4th event, and bilateral parties were agreed to further develop economic ties and give an emphasis on cooperation and intensifying relationship in economic sector, given the impetus on the sectors, for instance, mining, agriculture, food security, the tourism, and so forth. I guess many of you have read the reports and news from those events. And we, in the economic sector, also has a trade and investment facilitation agreement framework meetings, which is, we call it TIFA. So we have so far organized 6 TIFA conference last time. And needless to say, Mongolia and US defense cooperation is a many important pillar in our bilateral cooperation. As you all have know that Mongolia and the US soldiers served shoulder to shoulder in the hotspots of the world, like Afghanistan and Iraq. And we have joint multinational exercises like HandQuest, which became already a norm, which we hold annually. So in addition to that, there's a couple more mechanisms which I could mention here, like we have consular dialogue. As of the date, we have over 40,000 Mongolians living in the United States. So as number of Mongolians growing here, there's also issues are growing. And each time, whenever we have consider there is a need, United States State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mongolia, we hold the consular dialogue. Besides that, I would like to just briefly touch upon education and sector cooperation. We are working on more exchanges and to have more Mongolian students also to study in the United States, and also to invite more American students and also teachers, Peace Corps volunteers to work in Mongolia to promote the bilateral economic, education and cultural ties. So all these cooperation is what we are trying to continue, and those are devoted, of course, for further developing the bilateral ties. And indeed, all these would not have been possible. Actually, those are the continuity of the work of our predecessors and diplomats, the senior people. And now I think the keynote speaker of ours will touch upon the basis, the foundation, where we are standing now. Our keynote speaker will touch upon what has been the foundation of that and what was the history behind that. So I would like to, with that, conclude my speech, and then I would like to give the floor to the keynote speaker. Thank you.
So today's talk is Mongolia, the Bear, the Dragon, and the Eagle, 1984 to 1990. And it's a pleasure to introduce the co-authors. Ambassador Joseph E. Lake was the first U.S. ambassador resident in Ulaanbaatar, 1990 to 1993, as Mongolia began its successful transition from the second oldest Marxist-Leninist country to the thriving country it is today. He worked closely with Mongolia during the challenging period as Soviet economic assistance ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Mongolia built new ties around the world. He was also the first president of the American Center for Mongolian Studies, 2005 to 2009. Lake was a career diplomat with 35 years, serving 10 years in East Asia, 6 years in West Africa, and 5 years in the Balkans, as well as Washington and New York. He served as the second U.S. ambassador to Albania, on the United States delegation to the United Nations, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and Director of Operations Center in the Office of the Secretary of State. He retired in 1997 and returned following 9/11 to work part-time on management and communications issues. Since 2018, he and Michael have worked to build a foundation for future scholars on the history of U.S.-Mongolian relations through research, translation, and publications. Michael Ellen Lake is an author, researcher, and consultant specializing in digital transformation and strategic communications. Based out of Washington, D.C., Michael has worked on pathfinder efforts for the acceptance of cloud computing and artificial intelligence for the Department of Defense, supported the development of initiatives to leverage data as a strategic asset for both the State Department and the Navy, assisted with capacity building initiatives driven by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and worked at the U.S. Embassy in Mongolia. He continues to research and write on the history of diplomatic relations between the United States and Mongolia. His work has included multiple conference presentations, papers, and articles. He co-authored a chapter in the book Socialist and Post-Socialist Mongolia, published by Routledge in 2021. Through their research, translations, and publications, Michael and his research partner, Joe, are endeavoring to build a solid foundation of research for the future scholars on the history of U.S.-Mongolia relations. Although Ambassador Lake is not joining us in person today, we send him our warmest virtual greetings. And now let's welcome Michael Ellen Lake.
Sanbanu. I imagine several of you were expecting to see my father. He does send his regards. He does not travel as well as he used to. He is with us. Not only is he with us in spirit, but also literally, since we work on this. This is a representation of the work we've been doing the last several years, so he's with us in that regard as well. It is an honor for both of us to be asked to come here to speak at the conference. And thank you to the Mongolian Cultural Center, to Bill Fitzhugh and the Arctic Studies Center, and of course the Library of Congress. We're truly honored to be here. Two quick notes before we begin, one technical, one personal. The technical one, because I know we discussed this was discussed at the conference earlier today, there is some discussion and interpretation about whether the 1911 Proclamation of Independence was from China, was from the Manchu, or whatever, and things of that nature. We're actually working on more nuance. This something we're tackling in a book we're working on, again, to get into more nuance. But for today's presentation, we're capturing it largely from the perspective of the American government. So the American government, from their understanding at the time, was the proclamation from the Chinese. So that is how I'm going to be citing it in this. But I do understand, as I said, it is a deeper issue. Then just on the briefly personal note, my father spent 35 years as a diplomat. He and my mother crisscrossed this country. crisscross this globe rather, setting foot in dozens of countries. My brother, my sister, and I, we are what the anthropologists call a third culture child. I personally prefer global nomad or foreign service brat, but the key thing is we've been around, we've seen places. And for all 5 of us, Mongolia made an impact. Of all the places we have lived, we have worked, we have spent time, there is something about the magic of Mongolia that resonated with all of us, and that is why we continue to this day to write about it, to care about it, and to tell the story about how we normalize relations. Some of you know this story, some of you were part of the story, some of you are hearing part of it for the first time. This is a snapshot of how relations were normalized between the United States and Mongolia. So, Mongolia's 20th century history was marked by 2 key periods, 1911 to 1924 and 1984 to 1993. As a Central Asian landlocked country, Mongolia's only 2 contiguous neighbors, China and Russia, were key players in both periods. Yet both times, Mongolia reached out to a third power, the United States. For this reason, the changing dynamics of events involving its 2 neighbors in the last 18 months raises the question whether Mongolia is entering a new critical period. But the focus of this paper and presentation is on the second critical period, 1984 to 1993. That period was marked by Mongolia's changing relationship with the old Soviet Union and its ultimate collapse, the rapid rise of China and the beginnings of the new strains in its relationship with Mongolia, and finally, 75 years after Mongolia's first approach, the establishment of diplomatic relations with the United States. Now, while we are going to deal with the second key period, context is key, especially with history. So even before their proclamation of independence from China in 1911, the Mongols had sought support from Russia. After the declaration, they continued to seek international recognition and support from other countries, including a message to the United States requesting recognition. Sorry, so I got ahead of myself there, and so they said this is a copy of the Proclamation of Independence from China, and then they continued to seek recognition from other countries. Unfortunately for the Mongols, the gesture to the United States appears to have been lost in transit. It either was lost in the U.S. archives or lost in transit, if it's ever made at all. We have differing sources, and we're trying to track down and confirm exactly what happens. Equally unfortunate for Mongolia at the time, this gesture collided with Washington coming to grips with the reality of its changing role in Asia. Historically, up until that point, the U.S. interest in Asia had been driven by commercial interest and focused primarily on China. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. became a colonial power, and the acquisition of the Philippines was one of its driving forces. In 1911, the U.S. involvement in Asia was focused on China, Japan, and the Philippines. And similar to a 1912 message that Mongolia sent via the U.S. consul in Harbin, the 1911 message would have been viewed in the context of U.S. interest in China and Japan. And thus, without a champion in Washington, the 1911 message may never have made it all the way to the State Department. And if it did arrive, the sad fact is no one at the time was interested enough to act on it. The U.S. was focused on the collapsing Chinese empire. So Mongolia's 20th century struggle for national recognition was dominated by the competing interests of its 2 neighbors, as we said, China and Russia, and affected by the internal problems in both nations. It was only after World War II that China achieved internal stability. As for Russia, after the 1917 seizure of power by the Marxist-Leninists in Moscow, it became preoccupied with its own internal challenges. But by 1921, after success in Siberia, Moscow was willing to support the ouster of Baron Ungern-Sternberg and the communist takeover in Mongolia. Inevitably, after 1921, Mongolia considered the Soviets its protector from China. It was only with the end of Mongolia's own Marxist-Leninist rule in March 1990 that the United States finally became a relevant player in Mongolia's changing presence on the world stage. Before 1990, the challenge for Mongolia was the same as its nobles had discussed in 1688, Russia or China. As I intimated earlier, this paper started as one of a series of publications and presentations that the authors have produced in the development of U.S.-Mongolian relations. It's based on the memoirs and memories of American, Mongolian, Japanese, and Russian diplomats, as well as declassified records from the CIA and Department of State archives. Recent events have prompted us to study earlier periods of Mongolian history, and that has impacted our thinking on the future. For this paper, we will focus on For this paper, we'll focus on Moscow, Ulaanbaatar, and Washington from 1984 to 1990. But for a more complete story, including the impact of events in Havana, Tokyo, and New York, we refer you to our past and future research projects. The U.S. had shown episodic interest in Mongolia before 1987. In April 1921, the U.S. ignored political arguments for opening a consulate in Ulaanbaatar and opened instead a consulate in Kalgan, now known as modern-day Zhangjiakou. Commercial interests were the driving force, as Kalgan has historically been a key gateway from Mongolia to Beijing. With the chaos of the Chinese Civil War engulfed the region, American missionaries and commercial interests fled, and the consulate was closed on April 18, 1927. It was after, and again, similar to as we discussed earlier in the conference, it was after the Potsdam and Yalta conferences that the Soviet Union successfully pressed the United States to force China to recognize Mongolia's independence as part of its agreement to enter the Pacific Theater of Operations at the end of World War II. Two major changes occurred after World War II from the American perspective. One, the United States began to play a significant role in international affairs. And two, the State Department bureaucracy began to address relations with what they considered smaller powers, such as Mongolia. In 1961, the U.S. considered recognition of Mongolia as part of a broad policy initiative. But domestic politics in the U.S. and Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taipei successfully blocked the initiative towards Mongolia. However, the U.S. tacitly supported Mongolian admission to the United Nations that year by abstaining from both the Security Council and General Assembly votes. As the U.S. became increasingly engaged in Mongolia, and that issue began to dominate Asia policy, so Mongolia, unfortunately, continued to take a back seat. Mongolia, in essence, remained a part-time job for somebody in Foggy Bottom who worked on the mainland China desk. The bureaucracy kept the issue alive with occasional interest based on input from political appointees and external feelers from Mongolia. Yet the February 1972 Shanghai Communique changed the nature of U.S. relations with China, and thus Mongolia's place in the U.S. bureaucracy. The Office of Asian Communist Affairs was renamed the Office of China and Mongolia Affairs. Mongolia now officially existed within the U.S.'s foreign affairs bureaucracy. Now, March 14, 1973, the White House approved negotiations with Mongolia. This time, however, it was Moscow who put an end to the potential negotiations. They literally stopped an instruction cable sent from the Mongolian Foreign Ministry to their United Nations mission in New York. It was made very clear to Ulaanbaatar that negotiations could not continue as far as Moscow was concerned. But on the U.S. side, we heard only silence. And that, unfortunately, was a recurring theme in U.S.-Mongolia relations at the time, that neither side fully understood what the other was thinking. The U.S. official position of what transpired between March 1973 and November 1979 was, there's no real urgency to normalize relations, and that we remain interested and would welcome the opportunity to resume negotiations. In short, the bureaucracy had given up. However, that doesn't mean the rest of the world had given up, and we get to the 1980s and the meat of what we're talking about here. Leadership changes in Moscow and Ulaanbaatar altered the dynamic of the relationship. In Moscow, the rapid shift over 3 years from Leonid Brezhnev to Yuri Andropov to Konstantin Chernenko to Mikhail Gorbachev was dramatic. But no less dramatic was the 1984 removal in Ulaanbaatar of Sedenbal after 32 years in office. However, the events of 1984 to 1990 in U.S.-Mongolian relations have remained obscured by secrecy laws, regulations, and efforts by key officials in both countries to work behind the scenes and off the record. Some authors writing about the period have also been misleading and provided inaccurate information. The story of this period is one of the challenges faced by key Soviet Mongolian officials in seeking to bring change to their 65-year-old partnership. Efforts that were unfolding concurrently with Gorbachev's Perestroika and Glasnost initiative, and with his initiation of a new Northeast Asia policy seeking to improve relations with China. So in 1984, Moscow had concerns about Sedenbal's failing health, the machinations of his wife, Anastasia Fedotova, and the possibility that a worsening situation could all undermine Soviet interest in Mongolia. On April 29, 1984, the Politburo of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union passed a resolution that Sedenbal should be encouraged to resign from his leadership posts in both the government and the party. Thus, during their 1984 vacations in the Soviet Union, then Prime Minister Batmonk and fellow Politburo member Molomjets were invited to Moscow on short notice to meet with key Soviet officials on August 9th. This meeting was chaired by CPSU Politburo member Mikhail Gorbachev. Even though Chernenko remained in charge, it was his failing health that enabled Gorbachev to become the de facto leader of the Soviet Union. Sedenbal's physician, Soviet doctor Yevgeny Chezov, briefed the attendees on Sedenbal's medical situation. Gorbachev knew from the Soviet representatives in Ulaanbaatar that Sedenbal was planning to convene a plenum of the Central Committee of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party that August, and his intent was to remove Batmonk and Molomjats from the Politburo. Gorbachev pushed for the immediate removal of Sedenbal from his positions, and on August 17th, just over a week after the initial meeting with the Soviet leadership, the MPRP Politburo recommended Sedenbal's removal from all official positions. 6 days later, at the 8th plenum of the MPRP Central Committee, Sedenbal was officially relieved of his duties, and Batmonk was elected to replace him as General Secretary. Now, by coincidence, on September 19th, 1984, just 27 days after Sedenbal's removal, Don Johnson from the US Embassy in Beijing arrived in Ulaanbaatar. Johnson's visit was not an official gesture to Mongolia. Rather, it was initiated by Johnson himself. Although it was approved by the Department of State, Washington did not expect any significant result from this. Just prior to his return to Beijing on September 28th, Johnson was granted a meeting at the Foreign Ministry with Choinhor. He became the first American official received officially by the Mongolian government since Vice President Henry Wallace had visited in 1944. But once again, Soviet interest in China had an impact on Mongolia. On March 10, 1985, Chernenko died and was quickly replaced by Gorbachev as General Secretary. Gorbachev immediately stated his desire for improved relations with China, saying at the emergency CPSU plenum on March 11th, quote, "We would like a serious improvement in relations with the PRC and consider that given reciprocity, this is fully possible." When he met Chinese Vice Premier Li Peng on March 14th, Gorbachev reiterated his call for, quote, "serious improvements in relations." Now, the significance of Gorbachev's public pronouncements could not have been missed by senior officials in Ulaanbaatar. They were, after all, the Soviet Union's oldest ally. And one of the three obstacles to improve Sino-Soviet relations was the Soviet military deployment then existing in Mongolia. But coincidence is the name of the game, and another one happened in October 1985. An Asia Society study mission headed by Dr. Robert Scalapino from the University of California at Berkeley visited 7 Asian capitals and financial centers, including Ulaanbaatar. Although the significance of the Scalapino visit is obscured in American records, an early 1987 review of the normalization process conducted by the State Department's East Asia Bureau identified this academic contact as one of 2 seminal events for the United States. The authors believe that the key figures in the Mongolian government, including Batmonk himself, saw the Asia Society visit as a gesture from the United States, and thus was a catalyst for Mongolian efforts to pursue normalization again after the failure of the 1970s attempts. Now, the November 1985 Gorbachev-Reagan Geneva Summit, I know you didn't realize you have to take so many notes. That's why I've got this on the slide. You can track the dates that way. The November 1985 Gorbachev-Reagan Geneva Summit changed the tenor of US-Soviet relations. In his November 27th report to the Supreme Soviet, Gorbachev made the following point. The Soviet leadership attaches great importance to the Asian Pacific region. It is extremely important to ensure that this region is not a source of tension and an area of armed confrontation. We stand for the broadening of political dialogue among all the states in the regions in the interest of peace, good neighborliness, mutual trust, and cooperation. Now, recognizing the change, Batmonk himself said at a November meeting of the MPRP Politburo, the positive beginnings achieved at the Soviet-American Summit talks paved the way for by the constructive initiatives and practical steps of the Soviet Union and other socialist community countries aimed at improving the international climate. Despite these words, Batmonk was not likely to forget that the earlier attempt to develop relations with the United States, the one in the 1970s, had been halted abruptly by Moscow. The Soviets had made it clear since then that they would not support a change in the Mongolian-US relationship. Moreover, from Ulaanbaatar's perspective, Soviet support was crucial in facing their greatest threat, China. So we jump forward now to January 1986. And during his January meeting with Batmonk, Soviet Foreign Minister Edvard Shevardnadze took the initiative to raise the topic of normalization of relations between Mongolia and the United States. To be blunt, there are differing opinions as to how and why this was brought up at this particular meeting. The authors will be conducting a closer examination of that in our future work. However, the transcript of the Shevardnadze-Batmonk meeting does show a brief discussion of the topic. And Shevardnadze made a strong statement saying that the question had been considered by the Politburo of the Central Committee of the CPSU, and that establishing relations with the United States was in the common interest of the socialist community. He said it was not about speeding things up, but diplomatic relations were still possible and most likely necessary. Now, some Mongolian supporters of normalization saw this as encouragement to push forward. Others in the MPRP Politburo, however, they were not happy with moving ahead quickly, and Batmonk and DONGFANG in specific continued to express ambivalence. But of course, the US was unaware of this discussion and remained detached and somewhat disinterested. So we continue with 86, and you find that things fall along almost two geographic axes. For the first one, the authors continue to research the key events that happened between the January 1986 meetings and the U.S. formal approach to Nyamdo, Mongolia's ambassador to the United Nations, in August 1986. The U.S. has so far declined to declassify and release the next key document in the normalization process. Because of Mongolia's secrecy laws, we've been unable to obtain Mongolian documents and that would corroborate this information, and the Mongolian officials involved so far have been reluctant to share information. But there is a contradictory information from sources on both sides, including First Deputy Minister Yandin, as to exactly what happened, and some of which we can confirm is incorrect, some of which still needs to be confirmed. But back on the Pacific Rim, Dashtaran, the new Mongolian ambassador to Japan, arrived in Tokyo in 1986. He instructed his staff to send the routine circular diplomatic note announcing his arrival and looking forward to continuing good relations to the U.S. Embassy. For those of you not steeped in the nuance of diplomatic procedure, this is extremely unusual. Remember, at this time, the U.S. and Mongolia did not have relations, and such notes are not normally sent to an embassy of a country with which one does not have diplomatic relations. So the U.S. was confused. Was this a gesture? Was this a mistake? What was happening? We have a source that stated also that subsequent to his arrival, Dashtaran spoke with U.S. Ambassador Mike Mansfield at events where they were both present. The authors have found no official record that any of these activities were reported back to Washington. But this suggests, if they did happen, that Mansfield was using back channels, secure telephones, and stops by visiting officials in Tokyo to communicate on this topic. And that may sound a little far-fetched to some people, but I'll remind you, this is not that surprising, as this was the era of the Reagan-Poindexter National Security Council, a time during which a staggering amount of foreign policy was carried out through back channels, including activities later known as the Iran-Contra affair. Now, according to State Department records, in April 1986, the Japanese passed a message from the Mongolians to U.S. Embassy Tokyo expressing the, quote, strong hope that relations between the U.S. and Mongolia could be normalized. We do not know the content of the message, nor who sent it. As the Department of State has so far not released the reporting cable, we can only speculate. What we can confirm from other records is that the United States government, again, saw the approach as significant. Eventually, the Office of China-Mongolia Affairs of the State Department, which had not been involved in the earlier contacts, became aware of the Tokyo approach. The Mongolia desk told the U.S. Embassy in Beijing about the possible signal through Tokyo. Beijing political officer Don Johnson, the same Don Johnson who'd visited Ulaanbaatar in 1984, volunteered to make a second trip to respond to the approach. He received a diplomatic visa and arrived in Ulaanbaatar on Thursday, May 8th. For those of you who know your World War II history, you may see what's coming next. Because unfortunately, when Johnson arrived on May 8th, he discovered that all Mongolian government offices were closed in honor of the Soviet bloc celebration of VE Day, the end of World War II in Europe, on May 9th. Therefore, no one, even though he was in town, no one was available to receive him because of the holiday, and he returned to Beijing after 3 days. Then Gorbachev changed the situation dramatically with his Vladivostok speech on July 28th, 1986. Batmonk knew in advance about Gorbachev's speech and was concerned with the implications for Mongolia. 15 days after the speech, on August 12th, he discussed the withdrawal announcement with Gorbachev. Batmonk says that Gorbachev said his intention was to withdraw only, quote, 1 or 2 divisions. Batmonk pointed out that the reason for inviting Soviet troops into Mongolia in the first place had not been completely resolved: relations with China. Yet Gorbachev's Vladivostok speech was also read with interest in Washington, D.C. Then Assistant Secretary of State Gaston Seeger's interest was undoubtedly encouraged by Chinese Communist Party Secretary General Hu Yaobang's July 1986 conversation with a former U.S. National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, when Hu, in this conversation, suggested that now was the time for the United States to normalize relations with Mongolia. This was coming from Beijing and the Chinese side. This discussion was echoed in a direct approach to Seeger in Washington by Chinese Ambassador Han Shu. while the Chinese were acting in their own self-interest, coupled with the Vladivostok speech, there was no doubt in Foggy Bottom that the dynamics in East Asia were changing. So now we pivot and we look at North America right at this time. The only accurate record of events during this period are the official records of the Department of State and what they've released thus far. Unfortunately, those records are not complete at this time. And in certain areas, we're still looking for information to plug the holes. We also have relied on the memories of the officers involved, but to be blunt, given the time period, some of those memories have started to fade. Thus, we have tried to rely on the clearly identifiable facts to piece together what happened in this process. Based on the encouragement mentioned above that had come from the Chinese, U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz directed Seeger to initiate talks with Mongolia. The United States repeatedly assumed that the official Mongolian position was to move ahead quickly. However, Foreign Minister Dugusorin was following a go-slow approach, or rather we now know from documents that Foreign Minister Dugusorin was following a go-slow approach given his understanding of what Batmok wanted. Once again, the United States did not understand the difficult situation being faced by the Mongolians. Now, on August 28th, we're still in 1986, mind you, on August 28th, Vernon Walters, then the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, approached Mongolian ambassador Nyamdo and proposed they reopen the dialogue on normalizing relations. Nyamdo met with Walters on September 17th. He informed him of the Mongolian government's agreement to begin negotiations at a mutually agreed upon time. Walters observed that Nyamdo wanted the U.S. to propose a time that he could report back to Ulaanbaatar. This, in an apparent violation of his instructions, Nyamdo ultimately said his government would be willing to begin talks anytime before Dugusorin's address to the United Nations General Assembly, which was scheduled for October 2nd. Now, keep in mind that at this point, the U.S. was unaware of the negotiations on Soviet troop withdrawals that had been going on that autumn between Mongolia and the Soviet Union. They were equally aware of the tensions within the Mongolian government and the increasing strains in Ulaanbaatar's relationship with Moscow. However, with the decision to send the August instructions to begin the process to normalize relations, the Washington affairs bureaucracy became fully engaged. Seeger requested an analysis of why Moscow was sanctioning U.S.-Mongolian discussions and diplomatic relations. The normal course of procedures, that is something that is sort of unusual, especially after the Secretary has already told you to start going forward on this. So we believe the analysis was requested to put at least some of the back-channel information on the record following the official approach to Nyamdo. This meant that all the information that had been gleaned through his informal visits back and forth could now be part of the diplomatic record and could be acted upon. This would shift all relevant contacts into regular diplomatic channels. And it was also done in anticipation of the October arrival of the new Deputy Assistant Secretary of State responsible for China and Mongolia, J. Stapleton Roy. Roy had been one of the first Foreign Service officers trained in the Mongolian language during the 1960s. In the years since, he had become one of the Department of State's foremost China specialists, and his arrival at this stage of the negotiations with Mongolia was coincidental, yet it was critical. According to a CIA analysis, Mongolia had not made a direct and authoritative approach to reinitiate contact with the U.S. since Johnson's abortive May visit. But this analysis reflected how little the U.S. understood about what was transpiring in Ulaanbaatar. The analysis also misunderstood Foreign Minister Dugusorin's presence in New York as an attempt to emphasize the high level of importance attached to the talks. In his as-yet unpublished oral history interview, Roy has said that when he returned to Washington in October 1986, he found, quote, desultory interest in reviving efforts to establish diplomatic relations with Mongolia, end quote. Thus, he said, he gave the issue top priority in his new position. Now, on December 5th, new instructions were sent to the U.S. mission to the United Nations in New York to approach the Mongolians about a round of negotiations. They started on December 12th, with Roy negotiating on behalf of the United States. The pace had definitely changed in Ulaanbaatar. On December 17th, Nyamdo presented a Mongolian counterproposal based on the U.S. draft. What appeared to be normal negotiations dragged out the process, but on January 15th, Mongolian negotiators proposed signing the final communique as early as January 20th. Now, coincidentally, on January 15th, a formal announcement was also made that the first Soviet troops would be withdrawn from Mongolia beginning April 24th of 1987. Mongolia's strategic relationship with Moscow and the world outside the Soviet bloc had now changed irrevocably. And then on January 27th, 1987, Ambassador Nyamdo and Secretary Shultz signed the Memorandum of Understanding to establish diplomatic relations. 75 years after Mongolia had first approached the United States, the two countries finally normalized their relationship. Soviet support from Moscow continued to decrease over the next 3 years as Moscow wrestled with its own international and domestic economic problems. Moscow's economic support to Mongolia ended in 1991. That led to a disastrous economic upheaval for Mongolia's first post-Marxist government. The failure of the Mongolian and American governments to understand each other, and the U.S. indifference, the failure of the Mongolian and American governments to understand each other, and the U.S. indifference continued until Secretary of State Baker's visit in 1990. They have enjoyed a growing relationship since Baker's 1990 and 1991 visits firmly put Mongolia in the minds of key U.S. officials. It was during his 1990 trip that Baker suggested that the United States be Mongolia's third neighbor. And this theme became an important part of Mongolia's strategy as it reached out to the non-communist world. Now that is the historic part. But as we prepared this speech, we could not help but take notice of things that were unfolding in the world today. And the international dynamic changed. I know it's cliche to hear this in DC by now, but it is true that the international dynamic changed on February 22nd, 2022, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of Russia's European neighbors reached out to NATO. Meanwhile, China has supported Russia. Even as Mongolia's economic relationship with China has grown, this changing dynamic is impacting its ties with both Russia and China. How does this impact Mongolia's relationship with the United States? Has the relevancy of our strategic relationship been impacted in this new dynamic? We're still finding out. But on March 13th, in his first speech after being elected to an unprecedented third term as president by the National People's Congress, Xi Jinping implicitly reminded Mongolia that the U.S. as a third player is still relevant. Xi said, and I quote, "Bullying by foreign powers tore the country apart," end quote. Thus, the Communist Party of China has united and, quote, led the Chinese people of all ethnic groups in working hard for a century to put an end to China's national humiliation. China's national rejuvenation has become an historical inevitability, end quote. China has not forgotten that they consider Mongols as one of the traditional Chinese ethnic groups, and perhaps, like Hong Kong, they may even come to consider Mongolia a part of China torn away by foreign powers. And of course, another reminder of China and Mongolia's intertwined past, and I'm going to have to ask for your forgiveness for this because I am very bad when it comes to pronouncing Buddhist terms, was the Dalai Lama's March 8th acknowledgement of a Mongolian 10th Jebsum Dambat Kutukuk, the third highest ranking Lama in the Tibetan Buddhist hierarchy. His appearance has potential significance for China in its management of Tibet and implications for their province known as Inner Mongolia. And as a reminder for students of Mongolian history, when the Mongols issued their December 1st, 1911 proclamation of independence from China, it was the 8th Jetsum Damba who was named the first Mongolian head of state, the Bogd Khan. The implication of these events are still not fully clear. They continue to evolve. However, they are a reminder of the overlapping importance and influence of the bear, the dragon, and the eagle in Mongolia's history. And looking to the future, the question becomes whether Mongolia is entering another critical period in which it will have to balance Russia, China, and its third neighbor. But if, hell of a place to pause, I know. But if this is a new critical period, there is little doubt that Mongolia will continue to survive and thrive as a valuable strategic partner for the United States and its other third neighbors. It will, however, be the mandate of future scholars to tell the tale of how that unfolded. Which is why, in closing, I wanted to, in some ways, echo the statements that Ambassador BATBAYAR made earlier today, but it is something that my father and I both believe, and part of the reason why we do this. I want to take a moment to say that this and our other publications and presentations, those that we group under the collective title of Yaks on the Runway, are the direct result of my father and mine's intent to build an accurate as possible foundation to understand the events that took place during the efforts to normalize relations between the U.S. and Mongolia and to recognize the hidden players. We are striving to create an accurate accounting that can be a foundation for future scholars on this topic. We anticipate new information will continue to come to light as official records are released in the future and alternate records may be rediscovered. But this is an ongoing series of presentations and publications that reflects our own informed analysis. And thank you again to Cyril Urden of the Mongolian Cultural Center, Dr. SHAO and the Library of Congress, Dr. Fitzhugh and the Arctic Study Center for allowing us to come here today, share this piece of our research, and to hopefully entertain you for a little bit. And we would, as always, as I said, this is ongoing, if this spurs anybody to talk about a memory that their father or grandfather had, or a document that you have, or something like that, please reach out and let us know. This is an evolving set of history. We want to make sure to capture the foundation as accurately as possible. Thank you for your time. Absolutely. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if that was just so incredibly complete you have no questions whatsoever, I take that as a compliment too. But as I said, I'd like to view it as a dialogue. This is an evolving thing. So questions, comments, different interpretations, whether you're online, whether you're here in the room, please feel free to ask. Sorry, just like we're going to get you a microphone so that people online can hear what you're saying.
Okay. Looks like it's on. Oh, okay. I don't have a grandfatherly record to set straight, but I saw you mention, also I think it was in your article, you mentioned the scholar, Dr. Scalapino. Mm-hmm. And if my memory still serves me, there was also a prominent scholar, his name is John Hangin, or John Gombachao Hangin. I think Sarul mentioned him in the morning session. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Hangin is believed to have played, because he's an ethnic Mongol and he has been a U.S. citizen, has believed to have advocated for the normalization of the relation between U.S. and Mongolia for many years, mm-hmm. long before 1985. I think that's when Scalapino went to Mongolia, right? So I guess my question to you is, do you see anything in the official record about Hangin's involvement or contributions, both on the Mongolian side or the U.S. side?
So trying to make this into a short answer, give me just a second. But so there is some record and reference to Hangin. When we switch to the book and we have more real estate to talk about it, we're definitely going to bring him up and discuss it. But there has not been anything major that has been captured about his influence on bringing this forward. Now, but again, as I said, not everything has been fully released yet. So is it a question of there's information there that has not been released? Because there's, FOIA timetables and Freedom of Information Act, records released at different schedules. So is it something has not been released yet? Something was not captured? I don't know. So we definitely, like I said, in the book, when we get into deeper detail, we're going to talk about it to some degree. But I haven't seen anything that makes, no offense to Professor Hangin, but we have yet to find anything that puts him forward as one of the key advocates of establishing relations. But I'm going to look that up.
Thanks, Michael. Mike Orfini. Curious to see that the Arctic Study Center is part sponsor of this. It's not an Arctic nation, although there are 8 of them. Mongolia is not.
You've never been there in winter. It feels like an Arctic nation.
What's the connection?
I could answer that, but I suspect Dr. Fitzhugh will have a much more succinct way to put it.
Yeah. Well, I've worked in
Bill, for the people online, can you identify yourself? Oh, no, I mean, just say who you are.
Oh. I'm not sure I understood you.
For the people online, can you just say, Bill Fitzhugh from the...
I'm Bill Fitzhugh from the Arctic Study Center at the Smithsonian, and I'm pleased to be one of the co-hosts of this gathering. Most of you, I guess, were down at the Smithsonian earlier today. My specialty has been the Arctic prehistory of North America, and one of the big issues that has been investigated by our anthropologists and archaeologists for years has been the relationship of the Inuit people with the Asian peoples, and it's obvious that the Inuit people have a strong tie in that direction. So I followed Henry Collins, who did some early work, who found some very interesting 2,000-year-old connections between the cultures of Alaska, the Ipiutak site, and some of the Zhou and cultures of China and so forth. And so when I had an opportunity to go to Russia in the early 90s, when things opened up, I investigated the possibility of Eskimo connections in the Russian Arctic. I didn't find very much that was useful there because a lot of the Russian coast has been submerged in rising sea levels over the last 10,000 years. And so I turned to Mongolia, where I discovered many ties in the art history, particularly in the Bronze Age connections. And some of you may have seen the book that we have out down at the Smithsonian now on the work I've done for 10 years with Jamsran Shah's Barsay Khan in Mongolia. So it turns out that a lot of the early Mongolian deer stones and the art shown on those deer stones has a very strong connection with the Scythian cultures of the Black Sea, which always were thought to be post, the Mongolian deer stone art seemed like it was later than the Scythian art, a derivative art form. But our radiocarbon dates and work over a decade has shown that it's actually 500 to 800 years earlier than the Scythian cultures.
So to sort of,
Pardon?
So yeah, sorry. I was going to sum up, but if you have more to say, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've taken too much of your time. But anyway, that's the story that we found out, and it's what led me to Mongolia to investigate that possibility, and it's a very certain one that the Mongolian people have a very strong relationship with the Arctic peoples of North America.
So in short, you were exactly right. It's not an Arctic nation, but because
Thank you
of
very
those
much.
connections, because you never know for sure where science is going to take you. And in this case, it took them to Mongolia.
Well, and China has fairly recently identified themselves as a quasi-Arctic nation, and that's because of the new trading routes that may go through the Arctic now that the ice is disappearing. So I thought that was the connection to trade, but I didn't think of the indigenous, and that's exactly what it is. So thank you.
A very logical one, but that's more the political posturing side versus the pure science side. Did somebody hear a hand? No. Does anybody else have any questions? Or do we have any online? Oh, question over here.
Hi, Bolor Tsegminjing, American Center for Mongolian Studies. So I learned from your talk that you're creating digital collection for U.S.-Mongolian relationships, history documents. So can you give more information on that project? What is the status now?
Oh, no, I may have represented somewhat. It's not an actual digitization project. We sort of, in the process, we originally started out just trying to capture a snapshot of 1984 to 1990. Then as we discovered that, we discovered records not being sort of kept so well. So we've taken it on ourselves just to try to bring that together. Our hope is that once this is eventually compiled, this is going to sound like complete hubris when I'm standing in the Library of Congress saying this. Our hope is once it's compiled that it will be useful to a university or some other collection that can then take that to the next step. So it's not, while we are digitizing some of the stuff to make sure that it is preserved and we can use it, it is not, it's more of a byproduct of our effort as we look into this. But I will say it is actually horrifying to realize even things from the 70s and 80s are still in need of preservation. You know, we think of that as a relatively recent time. You know, you look back, like actually you're sitting next to somebody who is working on a great digitalization project, and she's dealing with stuff of huge factors of time older than what we're dealing with. So does that answer your question, or did I?
Yes, I just want to learn more about that. So I just think it's a really good idea to have some digital collection for these important relationships in historical in sense that, you know, like you're saying, other scholars and historians can use that, you know, information from anywhere from the world. And so I just thought it's a really good idea. So.
And I appreciate that and love hearing that because, like I said, we're just doing this on our own. We're not being funded by anybody. Nobody's coordinating it. Our hope is that somebody will be interested enough at some point to pick it up and make it into a real thing. But for now, we're trying to do what we can. So if anybody hears that idea and you want to give us some funding to do it, sure, we'll do that. But no, I hope it becomes a digital legacy that people want to look at, and that, like I said, future scholars, whether it's 30 years, 130 years, whatever, there'll be something for them to lean on, form their interpretations, and come up with things we haven't even thought of in terms of historical narrative.
Yeah, so our center has a library that we digitizing some of our stuff to, you know, make it available to people who are interested in Mongolia and all aspects of different sciences, you know, so.
Right, because you're part of Charles Krusakov. Isn't Charles Krusakov part of your group? Or?
Yeah, so, yeah, SMS.
Yes. So.
And your father is also has a history with our organization.
Yeah, he was one of the presidents, and I'm actually a member in good standing as well. So we should definitely have this conversation, just so we don't talk about this time. I love this conversation. Let's have this offline or at another time, but we'll definitely continue the conversation.
Thank you.
I know, a very nuanced topic, but if there are any other questions, do we have anything online, or are we okay? All right. Going once, going twice. And again, contact information, even if you have questions that you think of later, please feel free to reach out to us. This is our, as you maybe know, the tell from the bio she read, this is not our day job, this is our passion project, this is something we work on. We want to continue this future. We love having conversations about this with anybody, either to make them aware of the history, to find out new parts of history, like, for instance, tracking down, maybe spending more time tracking down stuff about Professor Hangen, or just even, to be blunt, I know I need to say to somebody in this room, but the more times we can raise awareness of Mongolia and of the connection between the U.S. and Mongolia, that always makes it a worthwhile day and a worthwhile conversation. So, if there's nothing else, thank you very much.